Now, welcome. I'm Amy Crane. I am the president of the rotation.org board, and I'm so excited to have you all joining us here today for our new coffee chat on working with neurodiverse children and youth. We do have an area set up on our website already. Some of you may have found it. I will send a link after our meeting. I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. Dina Kitchens has been volunteering with the rotation.org writing teams for past couple years now. She's written a number of lessons as well as working on our content team, helping us to refresh some of our older content. And she also has a life outside of us. She is currently in very rainy Atlanta, Georgia area. She's a volunteer at Brookhaven United Methodist Church, and she is also spending her spare time working on her doctorate. You can look at our site and see more of her bio, but I'm going to turn it over to Dina at this time. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you. And it is a Doctor of Educational Ministry that I am just beginning. So I appreciate prayers for that. So thank you for having me here today and for inviting me to share and my thoughts and insights on this. I have to confess, when I saw myself listed as an expert presenter, I kind of shuddered a little bit. I don't think of myself as an expert, but I do think of myself as an educator with some experience, with some knowledge, and with a heart for misfits. So over the years in my classrooms, I've often asked for particular kids to be in my class, often the kids that the other teachers didn't want, because I wanted them to know how much they were loved. My hope is that today we will learn how to do that for all the kids. I want to start out with a poem that I wrote as a devotional several years ago. It's based on the Beatitudes, and it kind of speaks to our population. And it's the basis of the book I have not written yet. I keep hoping. We'll see. Blessed children. Blessed are the children who will not be quiet, for they have much to say. Blessed are the children who cannot sit still, for they will move mountains. Blessed are those who cry, for they will comfort and be comforted. Blessed are the children who see things differently, for they will change the world. Blessed are the children who are always dirty, for they are at one with creation. Blessed are those who struggle to read, for they will hear and express the gospel in wonderful new ways. Blessed are the children who work alone, for they will know themselves and God. And blessed are the children who clown around, for they will make everybody happy. For we are all children of God, fearfully and wonderfully made. What are we talking about when we discuss neurodiversity? Merriam-Webster defines neurodiversity as individual differences in brain functioning regarded as normal variations within the human population. That means that we are all neurodiverse. Their second definition is the concept that differences in brain functioning within the human population are normal, and that brain functioning that is not neurotypical should not be stigmatized. And then there's their third definition. This is the one that reveals, I think, how we typically tend to use this term. The inclusion in a group, organization, etc., of people with different types of brain functioning. So when we say neurodiverse, we are usually thinking of people who fall within the autism spectrum, or those with ADHD, or sometimes individuals with learning disabilities, or what I like to call learning differences. But the reality is that diversity in brain function is present in all populations. Some stand out because of different expectations, or because fewer people display those certain characteristics. Some neurodiversity ends up in a diagnosis. Some may not have been diagnosed yet, or others stand out just because their neurodiversity affects their behavior or in some way sets them apart from the rest of the group. I love that Neil chose this image of gifts in the original posts for our coffee chat today, and I think the one that he sent out today too. Each of the kids in our ministry is a gift from God, and God created each individual with their own unique traits, including the unique way each brain works. If we consider each person as a gift, then we can appreciate the different ways that gift is presented to the world and anticipate the treasures within. Sometimes it is the differences that make that gift more unique and more of a treasure. But in order to appreciate and welcome those differences, we may need to adjust our usual ways of managing our ministry. I'm enjoying this metaphor of the gift, so I'm going to be using images throughout the presentation with that in mind. So now think about the kids in your ministry. You are likely expecting a group that looks kind of like this, a group of individuals with a few minor differences. In reality, your group probably looks more like this, different in more ways than you even realize. It doesn't make for a very uniform presentation like the first image, but it is much more intriguing. Here are only a few of the neurodiversity labels that you might find in your class. I'm sure many of you have heard of ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which includes difficulty staying focused and paying attention, difficulty controlling behavior, and hyperactivity. You may have heard it called ADD, but that is a term that is, I think, kind of passing in usage. According to the Learning Disabilities Association of America, between 3 to 5% of children in America have ADHD, and 30 to 50% of those children have an additional specific learning disability. And the interaction between the different conditions can make learning quite challenging. My colleague, Dr. Joan Teach, calls the presence of the multiple diagnoses alphabet soup. Many of our kids will fall into the alphabet soup category. Autism spectrum covers a wide swath of symptoms, including difficulty with communication, difficulty with social interaction, difficulty with sensory processing, and repetitive behaviors. The symptoms vary widely in type and in severity. Sensory processing disorder often accompanies the other conditions and is estimated to occur in 5 to 16% of individuals, according to CHADD, the Children and Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder organization. These children either avoid or seek sensory experiences. If they are hypersensitive, they may react strongly to sound, lights, or tactile stimulation. Or if they are hyposensitive, they may seek more stimulation. Dyslexia affects reading and language skills. People with dyslexia struggle with word recognition and decoding skills, which affects their reading comprehension. International Dyslexia Association estimates that as many as 15 to 20% of the total population may have symptoms of dyslexia. Tourette's is a syndrome characterized by sudden repetitive movements or sounds, often referred to as tics. Although it is not commonly mentioned, I add it here for personal reasons. My grandchild was recently diagnosed and was being punished at school for tics. Moving to a different school that did not punish the tic behavior has made a world of difference in this child's total attitude and well-being. Dysgraphia is a learning disability that is not commonly known, at least as a diagnosis. It involves difficulty in handwriting. Someone with dysgraphia demonstrates impaired ability to legibly form letters and numbers. Dyscalculia affects math and number skills. Individuals with this learning disability demonstrate difficulty understanding numbers and math facts, which in turn affects their math calculation skills. I've listed here only a few of the learning disabilities that you might have heard of or observed. It's helpful to know the different learning differences. However, in our setting, labels or diagnoses are useful only in identifying certain strategies to use. For instance, if a student has dyslexia, which interferes with the ability to learn to read, you would want to avoid asking them to read out loud in front of the group. It is important to note that no two people are alike. Even if they share a diagnosis, what works for one will not necessarily work for the other. Then there are those whose differences are not related to a diagnosis or a learning disability. Though they're within the normal range, these neurodiversities may show up as personality quirks or social differences. Some kids just don't seem to fit in for whatever reason. One such difference is introverts versus extroverts. Let's face it, this is an extrovert world. We're expected to be outgoing, but there are some who are slow to socialize. They need to feel the room before they can be comfortable participating. Many ministry experiences are planned with the extrovert in mind, whether intentionally or not. And mental health is also a consideration. More and more children, youth, and adults struggle with depression and anxiety. COVID certainly took a toll in that regard. Long periods of social distancing and online learning have affected our kids in their formative years. My friends who are still in the classroom are telling me kids are not the same. Whatever it is that makes a kid seem different, they need to be treated like the child of God they are, and it must be intentional on our part. So first, I want to tell you a story about my early years in teaching Sunday school. I was teaching a kindergarten Sunday school class that was mostly boys. It was the traditional Sunday school curriculum back then. You told the Bible story and then you worked the little flyer that came with the lesson. It was a small classroom with a big table in the middle, and along one wall was just a bookshelf that had some of our supplies and blocks. I was having a hard time keeping their attention while I told the story, and they couldn't answer the questions. They were too eager to get to those blocks and start building. So I began letting them build while I told the story. And guess what? They could answer the questions. They were hearing the story better with their hands engaged. They needed to have the busy hands. So, and it also turned out that all but one of those kids eventually ended up with a diagnosis. We didn't know it back then, but was the case. These kids are adults now, some of them with kids of their own. And the way we do Sunday school has changed dramatically. But that experience taught me to pay attention to the needs of the students rather than blindly following the lesson plan. Which leads me to my motto: teach the child, not the curriculum. I'm not sure where I first heard that, but that has continued to be my motto over the years. The best curriculum in the world is not useful if it does not meet the needs of each individual kid. So we need to get to know the kids individually, find out what is most effective for them and what might set them off. So today we'll discuss some strategies for engaging the kids in your ministry settings that might not fit the norm, whether it is due to a learning disability or another reason. So first, we're going to look at a few classroom management tools. These are a few things that I have found useful when I had neurodiverse students in my class. But the interesting thing is, usually these things benefited the entire class, so that when those kids moved out of my class, I continued using them. They're good for all kids. So as we look at these, consider how you might use them in your setting. So think about how you organize your time. I'm sure most of you keep a calendar, maybe a physical one like my mom does, paper on her shelf, or a digital one like the one I keep in my phone. And then on the next level, you may have a daily schedule that helps you remember what time your meetings are or your appointments. Some of you may keep a bullet journal. Often when you attend an event, you may receive a program that tells you what's happening when, or even on Sunday morning, many churches still have a bulletin that shows the order of worship, what's going to happen next. Sometimes kids with neurodiversity struggle with that lack of structure, with not knowing what's going to be next. They want to know what's going to happen after I do this. A visual schedule, and here's a little example of it on the right, helps kids and adults reduce stress by managing time. It helps us know what to do, when what we're going to do next and when it's going to happen. It may or may not have times. If your schedule is very time sensitive, then it makes sense to have the time that you're going to move to the next. But if not, just have them in order. As you finish one, you move to the next. I like to use, what I've usually used is little cards with Velcro on the back and a Velcro on a strip. Mine would go straight across, and we could put them in order with the Velcro. If something changed, we could change that. So now that you have your schedule, you know what's happening, we need to think about transitions. When anyone, especially a kid and especially one with a learning issue, if they're engrossed in an activity and suddenly told to stop and move on to the next thing, that can be disturbing. And that's kind of sometimes when you get behavior issues or even just chaos. So there are three things that can help those transitions go more smoothly. First, a consistent signal to get everybody's attention. It might be a bell or a chime. Some teachers will flash the lights on and off, or you might use a call-in response like or a clapping rhythm, 1, 2, 3, look at me, or something like that. The thing is you do need to pay attention to the children because some students may be triggered by certain sounds or by the flashing lights. So if you notice that that's what's happening, change the signal. And then once you find the signal that works for that class, use it consistently. So when you use the signal and you've got their attention, here's the part that tends to be tricky. Give them a 5-minute warning. Okay, kids, you have 5 minutes to finish your work, and then we're going to clean up. Now, what I have struggled with is getting the adults to understand that part. The adults start telling them to clean up right now. No, they're finishing their work. They're taking time to process, but they know that in a few minutes they will have to be finished so that then they can start. So then after that 5 minutes, you do the signal again and tell them to start cleaning up, start moving on, getting ready for the next activity. The third thing is to give clear, concise instructions. The fewer the steps, the better. Have them complete just 1 or 2, 3 steps before telling them the next thing. Often neurodiverse kids will only remember the last 2 things they heard, which means they're moving on to the last thing you said, and they haven't picked anything up. They're not being belligerent. They just don't remember that many different steps. So keep them simple, and then once one is finished, then you can add the next one. This whole strategy, this whole transition strategy was a game changer for me. I couldn't believe how much difference that made. So an important aspect in welcoming neurodiverse kids is the environment. I've noticed in general, we've come to assume that in spaces for children and youth, the more stimulation, the better. We tend to fill the space with as many colors and images as possible. We play background music while they're working, sometimes loudly, or we use loud, overstimulating videos of praise music or a praise band itself. For many kids, this is too much stimulation. Think of the difference between Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Looney Tunes. I've actually had to stop attending some of our church functions, the community gatherings, because they play this loud music over speakers the entire time. It's way too much, not only for my neurodiverse grandchild, but it's even stressful for me. Less is better. Simplify the room decor, avoid clutter, and use sound intentionally. Lighting can make a real difference. Light from fluorescent ceiling fixtures can trigger migraines and hyperactivity and can stress kids with autism. You may not be able to replace the lights in your space, but what you can do is leave the overhead lights off and use lamps in your space. That lighting is much more calming for many kids. Teachers have reported calmer classrooms after making the change from overhead lighting to lamps. Similarly, flexibility is important too. A trend in classrooms is flexible seating. There are a multitude of seating options available, from floor cushions to stability balls, to stools, to chairs, to benches and sofas. Wiggle cushions and yoga balls and rocking chairs allow students to move while they're listening and working. But a kid with weak core strength will struggle sitting on a stability ball or a wobble stool for more than just a few minutes at a time. So you do need to use those wisely. And finding what seating options can benefit your kids and providing choices can enrich your ministry settings for all kids. I looked at some of the questions that were sent in ahead of time, and though the questions differed, many focused on how to welcome kids into our spaces, how to help typical kids and volunteers interact with neurodiverse kids, and how to deal with behavior issues without neglecting the rest of the class. Some of the things I've already suggested: the environment, managing time through visual schedules and effective transitions, and getting to know each kid individually will certainly help. Additionally, being open to new ways of doing things is critical. It may mean a culture change for the entire ministry. Talk about how we are all different. Educate those in your ministry about neurodiversity. Don't focus on the diagnoses, but on the needs of the individuals. Everyone has different needs. When someone's needs are being met, when someone's needs are not being met, that is when behavior becomes challenging. So sometimes just being in tune to their needs will keep some of that challenging behavior from even cropping up. Look for the strengths within each individual and teach everyone in your ministry to do the same, including the other kids. I found in almost every one of my classrooms that the inclusion and acceptance of individuals with various differences resulted in a strong sense of empathy for the entire class. Here are a few tips to help. Read the room. Pay attention to the behavior during activities. If you pay close enough attention, you can usually redirect behavior before it becomes troublesome. Are they not interested in a particular activity? Move on to the next thing, or give them a choice to do something else, or have a helper sit next to them to help keep their attention. Have a basket of fidgets on hand so that they have something to do with their hands while they're trying to listen. Are they inching too close to another kid? Ask them to come up and help you with something. Limit sit and listen activities. Now, I know in formal worship settings, you may not be able to shorten the sermon time, but advocate for more interactive participatory elements during the rest of worship. Provide fidgets and coloring sheets to occupy hands during the sitting times. But in Sunday school, you have more control. Don't expect kids to sit for long periods of time just listening to the lesson. This is where the workshop rotation comes in. The lessons in workshop rotation are built around interaction and hands-on activities, and this will help neurodiverse kids, all kids. Provide choices. Build choices into your classroom so that the kids have a way to interact in ways that are meaningful to them. Even providing a choice of where and how to sit in your flexible seating classroom can make a difference. Give them choices of materials to use. Let them decide who they want to sit with. I tend to incorporate activity centers in my classrooms, and I learned long ago that it worked much more effectively to just let the kids choose which center they want to engage in and how long they want to stay there. Even in traditional worship, I prefer the phraseology, please stand in body or in spirit, rather than please stand as you are able. which to me kind of hints at ableism there. You're given the choice of standing or sitting, whatever fits your need at that point in time. Be sure to incorporate movement and hands-on experience. And again, this is the strength of the rotation lessons. When the body is moving and hands are engaged, the brain functions more effectively. A few of you asked about welcoming nonverbal kids. Talk to them. We tend to assume if they're not talking that they're not understanding it and understanding what we say, but that's not always the case. And the less we talk to them, the less opportunity they have to interact in any way, and this isolates them even more. So you talk to them, you use visual ways to communicate as well as verbal ways. You can use, this is where the visual schedule comes into play. They've got the pictures to show them what's coming up. Use gestures when giving instructions. Some individuals will have other avenues of communication, such as a communication board or a device. If that's the case, learn how to use them and use them. Teach your volunteers how to use the devices that they have. Sometimes there will be times when a nonverbal kid needs to engage in screen time or sensory time to help them cope. Respect that. Which brings me to the next topic that I want to address. It doesn't really fit into any of the categories that I've covered, but it fits into all of them at the same time. Sensory experiences help regulate emotions. A sensory experience can be as simple as a deep breathing exercise, or as complicated as a whole sensory room that you can let your students go to when they need a chance for emotional regulation. And that's what the sensory does. It helps with emotional regulation. You can provide sensory activities in your space. You can introduce sensory activities in response to certain behaviors. Calming bottles, slime, and fidgets all fit into that category. You do not limit them to just your neurodiverse kids. We all need emotional regulation at one time or another. I actually have two little strips on my computer here, a calming strip and a little textured prayer strip that can help me kind of focus by rubbing on it and feeling that texture, a tactile sensory experience. So as an example, I want to introduce you to this young man here. I'm going to call him Joey. Obviously, that's not his real name. Joey is a neurodiverse child, and I've noticed that one of his traits is sensory seeking. Some weeks he would come in all out of sorts. Different factors in his life were creating stress. Now, my classroom was based on centers, and one of them was a wilderness box, a little piece of the desert in which they can reenact some of the stories, the wilderness stories. On those days when Joey was stressed, he would head to the wilderness box, and he would just spend some time running his fingers through the sand, or sometimes he would go get something from another part of the classroom and kind of interact with boys in the sand together. Point is, after some time in the sand, he was self-regulated and ready to engage in what else was going on. So think of ways to provide sensory calming opportunities in your ministry. I think that I'm going to need to add a whole sensory topic to our forum because there are so many different ways to use this, but it is so important. Now, it sounds like I've been talking about children here, and we have some teens in our ministries too. Most of these ideas will work for teens as well. I'm not sure about the visual schedule, except, you know what? Maybe they would enjoy picking out emojis to represent what's happening in their program. Your transition strategy might use, a different kind of signal. You might not want to do the 1, 2, 3, look at me, but maybe a ringtone, a popular ringtone, or some kind of sound or music that means something to them could be the signal. But that chance to have that transition not be that sudden change can be really useful. The environment factor is certainly important in this. We assume even more in youth spaces that overstimulation is key, and that doesn't work for many of these kids. So we need to remember to keep things simple in our youth spaces as well. So we need to be attentive to their particular needs, just as we do with our kids. And as far as sensory activities, you know what? We don't outgrow that need. A friend of mine was offering me a fidget for my 10-year-old grandchild and said, well, I don't know if they're too old for fidgets. I said, are you kidding? I'm not too old for fidgets. You don't outgrow that. So anything that you do for your kids will probably work for teens. Just don't make it look childlike. I'm always amused on TV shows and movies when they open gifts, they just lift the top off. Let's go and see what's inside. You know what? That's not the way it happens. We usually have to figure out how to remove the bow and the ribbon. And it may be as simple as just pulling one of the strings and it'll all come untied, but it may not be that easy. It may be complicated. And then there's getting the wrapping paper off. How much tape does the gift giver use? Well, there are certain people that we know there's going to be tape everywhere. And sometimes I like to be tricky. I will wrap a box in different layers. You open the big box, and inside is a smaller box wrapped. You have to wrap, unwrap 2 or 3 different boxes before you get to the gift. Well, you know what? That's much like what it is with our kids. We have the challenge of unwrapping, of finding the strategies and tools to engage each particular kid. But wow, the treasures we find when we do. So I've tried to address the questions that were sent in ahead of time. There was one that didn't fit into this that I do want to mention. Someone asked about events, whether inclusive events or specified events was preferable for the community, or a combination. And that's, yes, combination. A lot of it just depends on your population and your setting and your resources. A church I'm familiar with yearly has I can't remember if it's like a summer camp or a vacation Bible school specifically for special needs kids. It's a large church. They have the personnel for it. They have someone on staff who has that specialty and knows how to do it. But I think a combination is either inclusivity or combination. I don't really like this separating them out from everybody else on a regular basis, either for them or for the rest of the congregation, for the rest of the kids. It helps to get to know each other and to know that we're all different. So I guess we might be ready for some questions.
All right, there have been a few typed in. I think thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I think you gave us a lot to think about.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg is the problem. There's so much more.
These resources will be shared at our website. Carol had shared the link earlier, and I think there was one question early on about your blessing or blessed poem, if that was shareable, and we will put that on our site. Is that something?
Yes, but give me credit, please.
Yes.
I am hoping in my dreams that one day it will be a book, but
Amy,
who knows?
Amy, I wrote down a couple of the questions that were posted in the chat, and I would encourage people to, if you have questions, to put them in the chat now. Carol's watching it while I'll read from some of my notes, and we'll just fling them at Dina and see what happens.
Yep, I think Ian.
One of the first questions, other than where can I get a copy of that poem, was how do you handle competition for these special resources? And the question was originally about special seating. Every kid wants the most specialist chair, even the not atypical kids, but also some of these special resources. I know if I put a box of sand in the corner of my classroom, my teaching assistant would be over there too.
Well, good for them. And that's something that I think choices is good, and when they all have choices, not just the special students, that it's a the very first time it's a attention getter, everybody goes for it, but then it just becomes natural, and you have enough. You try to for things like fidgets, just have enough for everybody. There's no reason that you have to limit the fidgets only to the people that you think need them. Because guess what? Someone else may need them that you don't know.
In the chat, Ian Grimm, one of our board members and regular participants in our Zoom chats, he posted an Amazon link to a wonderful grab bag of different types of fidgets designed for classrooms. And I just let the cat out of the fidget bag. I also asked Ian, and I'm going to ask Heather DeWitt, who also said their church does it too, and she's listening here today, to write more about that and send some photos so we can post them in our new forum.
Yeah, so fidgets, that covers so many different things. The little sticker that I was talking about can count as a fidget. Remember back in the day when we had the corded phones and that little spiral, and when we talk on the phone, we played with the spiral? That's fidgeting. When you're in a meeting and someone is clicking their pen, they're treating that pen as a fidget. My grandchild, who is not only Tourette's but have kind of on the spectrum, it is believed, was asked for and received the controller for video games, not just to play video games. Em likes to kind of to drum on the bottom of that game, and sometimes it's with gloves, sometimes it's without gloves. There's something about that, doing that pattern on the bottom of that controller that fills that need. So there, like you can Google and you can look on Pinterest and Amazon, and there are so many different fidget possibilities out there. There's some you can make yourself.
Well, we'll have the sensory topic too in our special
Yes.
NeuroDiverse resources list. So, and I see lots of wonderful resources being shared in the chat. Thank you all for this.
I just saw someone post that a prayer station can be a sensory activity. Yes, amen to that. Play-Doh, slime. I mean, it is kind of limitless, to be perfectly honest. But part of the thing is having access to that throughout the time in the ministry sessions.
Hey, Dina.
I'm sorry.
Just one quick question too, as we move forward. I also want to say, I know we had talked about how do we make sure that some kids don't feel left out, like if other kids have fidgets. And while that's something that we probably are concerned with, this is so common and prevalent in schools now that kids know about these things in ways that we never did when I was growing up. And so they're very aware that they have classmates and friends that have different needs to be able to learn. And so for the most part, if you let the kids know that are upset about it, why, they've heard that before, right? So they're comfortable with that, and so they kind of understand that. I had a question I wanted to highlight. There's lots of great questions here, but just because he's from my alma mater, MacU, Kyle Krill wanted to know if any suggested guidelines about enforcing ages in different ministry rooms. And I think too, coupled with this is the fact that a lot of times our kids that are neurodivergent may not be at the same level cognitively as their ages. So how do we navigate that?
That is an interesting question. And I'll have to say, from my perspective, I advocate for multi-age groups. Now, that said, my settings tend to be small churches. So we may have everybody in one class. But there are different advantages there. First of all, the fact that they can be in a class that's at the level, that matches theirs, but also younger can learn from older and older can learn from younger. That's kind of where I am with it. And from like even before all of this, we before COVID, we had two individuals in our small little congregation. We had a young woman who was in her 50s who functioned on about a maybe 7-year-old level. She loved to help in the children's ministry. And we let her come, and she was a helper, but she ended up doing what the rest of the kids were doing. And it worked nicely. She loved to be the Easter bunny at the Easter egg hunt. We just had to remember not to count on her to be the responsible person in the room, not leave her alone with kids. But then we had another not young man, he's retired. That was not his interest at all. He would go to actually my husband's Sunday school class, and some of the people there would help him. They would like read the Bible scripture to him, or find ways to help him function in that class. So I kind of think you do what works with each kid. So a question that popped up that distracted Ian and I both was basically about family members and keeping their hands off each other. And yeah, I get that. My kids were always in class together. And part of that is keeping them busy enough. So one of the things I mentioned in there is to limit the sit and listen. Maybe find ways that they're in different spaces. And they have something to do so that eventually they're going to forget about each other. That's all I can say. Does anybody else have better advice for, keeping siblings and cousins and whatever from bothering each other during your sessions?
I think you can ask them to move to a different seat too. They're
Yeah.
not directly next to each other. We're still in touch. I think Neil said there were a few more questions that.
Yeah, I'm going to throw a couple at you here that people have posted. One is about training resources for teachers. And another one is, I guess, training resources for the congregation. How do you promote understanding and inclusivity with regards to neurodiverse and special needs kids?
You know what? That's something we're going to need to research. I will say that among my Facebook groups, I'm in a lot of groups that are ministry related. There's a lot of interest in that area right now. And actually, there's one or two websites that I have not had a chance to put on our website, links to on our website yet, mostly because I was frantically getting ready for this and for a sermon I'm preaching on Sunday. So I scheduled everything at the same time. But over the next weeks, we will add things. But there's something called Key Ministry that deals with inclusivity, both in special needs and in mental health. Look them up, KEY, Key Ministry. I can't give you the email address, the website address right now, but I will find it and post that. So some of those kind of resources they probably have some things that will help with that.
I should say that everything that Dina is mentioning here won't be exactly a transcript, but you could either hear it in the recording or we'll follow up and post on it later, probably early next week. And we'll also, some of your questions that go unanswered, we'll throw them at Dina afterwards. The recording saves the chat questions. So awesome. Somebody was asking about support for Christian summer camps. And that's an interesting question because Dina and I were recently talking about a lesson plan where we were talking about a song that was popular in summer camp and maybe using it in Sunday school.
This may or may not be related, but my youngest son worked at the local summer camp, the United Methodist summer camp, as a camp counselor. And the first year he was, I'm not sure where he functioned, but then from then on, well, let me preface that. He is very introverted. He definitely fits in the introvert scale there. middle school teacher once called him painfully introverted. But when he was working at the camp, and some of the other counselors were like, you need to be more perky. But some of the kids specifically gravitated towards him because they needed that quiet persona, and he listened to them. He ended up then being a counselor in something called Shadowwood. I think that's what it's called. They had a section of the camp specifically for special needs. But so some of the camps have some of those opportunities, and it really kind of depends on the camp. Now, if you're talking about the summer camp that your own church is doing, use the same kinds of suggestions that we've offered here.
I wanted to highlight another question because I think it's a really sensitive topic, and we need to cover it on some stuff. But there was a question about any tips on initiating conversations with parents of neurodiverse kids to better understand individual children's needs. I want to preface this one also by saying, because we've had this experience in a large church, just because we know or we think we know, unless you are a medical professional, you cannot have a conversation about diagnosing a kid. That is a very sensitive topic, but there are tools that we can use and conversation things that we can do to kind of begin those conversations. So can you share a little bit about that?
I'm glad you said that. It is very important to realize we cannot diagnose. I mean, we do that. We look at someone and say, oh, well, they're ADHD. We cannot do that. Now, and as a matter of fact, our church, we just started an ESL program, and I'm helping with the child care, and we had a student come in last week. Okay, the behaviors were very stereotypically behaviors that you recognize in autism and children with autism. And everybody's saying, oh, he's definitely autistic. We can't do that. We can say these behaviors are what are happening in this classroom. What do you know about your child that will help us engage your child and help them fit in? Well, not even fit in, help them get more out of what we're doing. Something else, whenever you're talking to a parent, I kind of had thought this was common knowledge, but I'm realizing that it's not the case. The sandwich method. You start out with something good. I like how happy your child is when they come into the room. You mentioned the concern that needs to be addressed, and then you end with something good. So you sandwich whatever your question or issue or challenge is in between those slices of praise for that child, because every person has something you can praise about them.
Well, it was a large question, I think, but I do think that so what we've done in the past is if we notice behaviors, we can ask about specific behaviors, right? So if we say, hey, he's really having trouble paying attention during the message time, or he's really having trouble focusing during our group time, do you have any tips or tricks that can help us, right? If you bring them in on that conversation, and then once you initiate that conversation, then if they bring up, at school they've said this and they do this, and then we can say, okay, what other tools does their school give you to help? Because we can implement those as well. And then and then eventually, if there is a diagnosis, once they divulge that to us, now we're able to offer even more resources. But it is very sensitive because you do not want to, you don't want to diagnose a kid what you think it is, because that could, that's a very touchy subject. So,
and a lot of parents are in denial, even if they've been told, that there's a diagnosis. They don't want to admit it.
Right. Yeah, we've got a lot
or they certainly don't want anybody else to know.
Mm-hmm.
So I think addressing specific behaviors and asking for their help. Hey, can you tell us what works for you? Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what works for the school? that brings them in on, how can you help us help your child? And it makes it a little more affirming, I think.
Dina, I wanted to know if NeuroDiverse also includes people with, I think, what you consider more classic medical conditions. Years ago, one of my daughters started experiencing something that we later learned to call ataxia. And like a lot of like a lot of problems, they're triggered by certain environmental conditions. This goes back to several questions about headphones, cacophony. Um, it actually triggers imbalance and a feeling of I got to get out of here. I know that some people with agoraphobia, the fear of being in crowds, even if they have a little bit of it, or if they feel smashed into worship, um,
Yes.
I don't know that that's classically part of neurodivergence, but it seems to be a special needs, and I want to highlight it as something that a number of years ago, our church had to create an overflow room for a small sanctuary before we built a bigger one. And what we thought was that overflow room would be filled by some people who had some special needs. And what we ended up having was an overflow room because a lot of people couldn't stand the noise, the cacophony, the level of the volume of the organ. It had as many older people in it as young people, and
Well, yeah, that would be me.
Yeah.
I've left the room during some of those loud praise band episodes because I physically couldn't handle it. I'm also the person that in a crowd, I don't see what's going on. I see elbows and backs because I'm less than 5 feet tall.
How do you balance that? And I think a related issue is, especially in workshop rotation, we talk about having these fantastic rooms that are a feast for the eyes, that excite the senses when they walk in. But one of the comments you'd made in your presentation was to have a simpler, maybe a more muted room for people with special needs and neurodivergence. And I think it's just a natural wrestling point between what's good for one group is not good for another. How do you deal with that?
But there are things that you can do to kind of have that theme and that specialness of a room that's still not so busy. Okay, you don't have to have everything that you can think of in that room that fits with that theme, but enough that it feels like that special room. So I think part of that is okay, my old brain is not coming up with the word, but being in the median, not too much, not too little. Moderation. Yeah, moderation was the word I couldn't think of. Thank you. And a lot of those rooms are wonderful, but I've seen classrooms, especially in like early elementary, that are way busier than our rotation rooms that I've seen pictures of. So I actually like having the themed rooms, and I think that helps. That actually kind of helps the kids focus on what's going on in that room. Just don't fill it up with too much stuff. Also, think about lighting, and think about not having too much sound too long. You mentioned headphones, and I struggle with the whole headphones thing. Because my grandchild needed headphones for a while, and now they're kind of pushing away from that. But that loud music at the events is stressful. This child cried the whole time at their aunt's wedding because the pianist has a heavy hand and was too loud for him.
Yeah, I think the key is if you're in a small church, you can adjust to the individual needs of the kids.
Yes.
Some kids need, somebody asked a question about chairs. And I know from, again, my daughter with ataxia that the type of chair really matters. Because it affects her sense of balance and how high is it off the floor. The warmth of the room, how warm is it? Heat is a trigger for some behaviors and conditions. Things like mildew can really create a problem for some people.
I didn't mention smells.
I don't like that at all.
Smells is smell. Well, I mean, I like the thought of using incense sometimes, and I found out I can't do that,
Yep.
you know. And this was for a class for adults. And but as soon as someone said, that's bothered me, I put it out. So it's that paying attention. Now, in a big group, that's harder to do. But if you have enough people to kind of pay attention to the individuals and then communicate, you may not be able to take care of it in the moment, but you can remember it for the next time.
Good point.
I also think with the rooms, something that we do, because you do want to create inviting environments, but you can do that functionally, right? So you've got your visual schedules, you've got your things that help with inclusivity that you use to decorate the room, as opposed to just being a decoration, right? It's just there on the wall or whatever. There's a purpose behind it, and it helps move that ball forward, as opposed to just being a thing that's there.
Wonderful point. Yeah. Ian, I think you're going to need to start adding some things to our to that forum as well.
I'll do my best.
So I'd like to go back. I think Cal has asked a few questions. Cal, do you want to unmute and let us know? I think some of it's been hard to read it all, but it's been a conversation about, I think, different ages, mixing the ages together. And I do think that is a problem in some churches when you have the developmentally delayed person wanting to stay in a room that they're not maybe size appropriate for. Is that, can you clarify what you're asking?
I've got a young boy who would be best fit in the nursery because he's just recently, in the last couple of months, his family has figured out that he is on the spectrum. He's still too early to tell if he's really going to be nonverbal or not, but he is 3. This next year, we would normally put him in the next room, but it seems like right now the better space probably for him is the nursery. But eventually he's going to bowl over those little kids. He's going to, play hard. In fact, he already has taken toys and shoved some smaller children already. But, it's like, oh, okay, there's that. Like, when do you move a kid up when they, we'll say, seem to identify better in that group? In a similar situation, I have got a couple of girls who, now, one of them was already 18 and the other 19. They had been, I guess, in the youth ministry a year past what would be considered their normal graduation date, but they're schooled from home because of their various, let's say, neurodivergencies. I don't really know what everything both of them are, but they wanted to continue to stay. And by now, one of them is actually 20, and it's like, okay, I get that you may even have some old friends there. You may even like benefit here. I figured out one of them actually does not even have the capability to read. So it's not like she's going to go into an adult Sunday school class and be able to like participate on the same level. But they're like, hey, when do you move this kid along? Especially when we're talking about a youth group that is it's junior high, like 6th grade through high school.
I have a feeling Ian probably can handle that better than I can.
So I mean, I'll say what I was thinking. So for the first part of that, when you got the younger kids, here we have what we call a buddy program. We have it's called Seeds of Hope is our ministry. We have Seeds of Hope buddies that are inclusion buddies. They are trained, they're recruited and trained to be that kid's buddy, right? They are in that room specifically for that kid. And so that adult leader who's there specifically for that kid helps keep that kid focused and on track, but also helps be that buffer a little bit, because we do have some kids that are in classes that they're probably too big for, too old for, but that's where they are and it's where they're going to learn best, right? So we partner as many of those kids up as we can with a buddy that's going to help facilitate that inclusion for them. And then also, hey, don't smack the other kids with the truck or whatever, right? So stuff like that. The other half of that, the top half of that, and this is, and I hate to throw like another thing on a ministry, because I get that we're all doing so much and we're all doing the best we can. The first thing I would say is really consider if this is a prime opportunity to begin an older special needs ministry, to really consider, okay, how do we take the two kids that we have and really invest in them and make this something bigger, right? The other side of that, I would say, is maybe create not your Wednesday nights or not your Sunday nights, whenever it is, but create special events that like we talked about before, that are combined, to where if they do have friends that are in that group, they're probably only a couple years younger, right? And so you could do a high school event or an upper high school event, a junior, senior, and invite some of your old students back and say, hey, we're going to do kind of a young adult-esque, like we're moving into that now, right? To kind of help bridge that gap. This is a couple ideas that I would share. So whatever, Dina, if you've got some, or yeah, Neil.
You're right in there, close to what I was thinking. And now I haven't been on this side of the equation from the ministry leader situation, but when I was coming up, we had a very close youth group, and we had some who graduated out of youth group, but were still hanging around. They started something called the bridge between youth and adults. They had their own group, and they sometimes would do things with us and sometimes do things just for themselves. And then we did that when we graduated high school. Those of us who didn't go to school out of town, so having something special for just that age group that's not your typical adult class, and gear what you do to your population that you have at the time. So in this case, it would be a special needs kind of thing, but it could morph into something different if other kids get involved as they age out.
I was going to say that it's, to chime in here, that what both you said, it's so situational.
Yes.
I remember we had a kid named Bobby, and he had a twin. I can't remember the twin's name, but they both had Down syndrome, and both of them responded to our different approaches. Bobby loved coming into our computer lab. He was one of our first computer lab buddies. That's what he wanted to do. Different age groups rotated in. And so we kind of turned him into a teaching assistant. His twin wanted to sing, didn't want to be in the classes at all. So we put a buddy with them and put him in the choir. And the choir was one of the best things. And I just want to add this. I think it's something we all know from experience, that sometimes the best ministry is also what you're offering to the parents. Just that somebody cares, somebody's embracing their kids, somebody's trying with their kids, somebody giving them a break from their kids. There's a huge ministry to be developed there. And the parents that came to us with these two Down syndrome kids had been to other churches where those kids just didn't fit in. They didn't feel accepted. And they would tell us wonderful things about our church. And in a long story short, they ended up ministering to us because all of the younger kids in elementary school got to know, Bobby through his being in the computer lab. And he was no trouble because we found the right thing for him to do that fit his need.
That's the big thing, and it's not always easy to do, but find what works for each individual person. I love it.
We've got some material at the website already about anxiety.
Yes.
We pulled together, which is a major mental health crisis right now. I personally believe that it went undiagnosed for decades with many of our kids, and that what we're seeing now is just we're very aware. I think it's gotten worse, but I do think we're becoming aware what the signs are, and
right.
Kids are. But yeah, it's a broad subject.
When we were doing our class covenant in September, one of the kids put relax as a part of our class covenant. And
Beautiful.
yeah, and so we're looking at getting some beanbag chairs and trying to find some ways to make it a non-stressful environment. And I also really like to get something done. And I'm looking at trying to find the balance between being so laid back and comfortable, and also like how do you pull yourself out of a beanbag chair in order to go do the next activity? And I'm wondering, with those of you with more experience with that, how you found that balance.
As an adult or as a child?
Well, I know I have trouble with it as an adult.
Fire ants. That's what I would say. I'm just kidding. Don't do that.
Well, I
Okay,
think one way you can relax is simply to not keep shrinking the amount of time you have for your Sunday school lesson. When we first started in the writing team, we were writing 55-minute lessons. Now we're writing 35-minute lessons. It's like, how can you be creative and do all the teaching you want to do and see to the needs of kids in 35 minutes, which on any given Sunday gets cut by 5 or 10 because people showing up later, leaving early, or the sermon goes long. Like, one of those things is just give us time so that we're not feeling rushed through our lessons, and we can maybe do some more less stressful, fun activities and interaction.
another piece of that is that it is possible that what that person needs more than the lesson is that calming time. If what did I name him? Joey. If he needed to spend the whole time at the wilderness box, I don't think that ever happened, but if he needed it, we would let that happen. Sometimes that kind of goes back to teaching the child, not the curriculum.
Mm.
But you would continue the lesson with the rest of the class. And
you know what? They're listening. They're probably listening. Lots of times when you think they're like my kids with like my boys with the blocks, you think they're engaged in something else. They're still hearing. Kyle has another question.
Yeah, I'll just keep it short. Here it is. You had mentioned just a few minutes ago about diagnoses. Is it insensitive to ask for a formal diagnosis for people who are requesting special, treatment for their kids?
So in our situation where we're at, we don't officially offer services until we have a diagnosis. Till mom and dad or whoever comes with and says we have a diagnosis of this. Now, that's not to say that the tools that we utilize in those areas, that we don't also utilize those same tools with other kids, because the reality is, like we talked about, it being a spectrum for a lot of these things. Even if a kid doesn't have a diagnosis, there are ways and things that our tools can do to help. But we don't, our buddy system and our sensory room, we do ask mom and dad to bring a diagnosis, an official diagnosis, so that we can, and honestly, like, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but on our side of that policy, that's a lot of that is for legal reasons. We have to make sure that we are legally doing what we are allowed to do. The other side of that is as ministers, especially in next gen ministry, our calling, and it's a lot of fantastic people put it on there. We partner with the parents, right? We partner with the guardian. And so we can encourage that. We can say, hey, listen, just like we would with anything, right? Like, hey, your teenager is out smoking pot and drinking, right? Like, maybe you should have a conversation about, like we would have those conversations, right? But for this, it is more sensitive. But if we notice, I'm going to say, hey, I know you've asked me about this, and we've talked about this. I would really encourage you to go and see a doctor, and whatever we can do to help, right? If it's an insurance thing, if it's a whatever, like, let's just get this done, right? How do we? And that, in those moments, Kyle, we fall back on, ministering and pastoring and doing all those awesome things that we've been trained to do and then gifted to do, to be able to have those conversations with tact and with love, right? So, but officially, we don't do anything officially until we have a diagnosis. That's our situation. Now there are other situations that do it entirely different ways. So,
Well, and Ellen posted that every fall the parents complete a registration, and on that form they invite them to share their child's IEP with them if they have one.
Mm.
And she says it's amazing how many no, she says it's a way to ask about a diagnosis without asking about a diagnosis. And then it's amazing how many families actually volunteer their IEPs. So that's one way to kind of get at that as well.
Yeah, I want to go back to something that Kyle brought up, which is, when do you tell the parents, or do you let a kid bring a lap or a tablet simply because that's something that the parent says works for them? And I'll go back to something Dina said, the image she gave us, the gift metaphor of the challenge of unwrapping the gift, which is the child, and going through the layers and finding out what works. I think we've all had experiences with typical kids as opposed to atypical kids, where you find out what works to get the word of Christ heard in their heart. And I think it's the same thing with how do you engage a kid? How do you get them to engage in church life and faith life? And it's not the same for everybody. And I think kids with special needs and neurodivergence, I think I would have the same approach. So one of the first things I would say, Kyle, is I would not dismiss what the kid needs simply because the parent is unwilling to be a parent. My calling is to minister to the child and hopefully reach the parents. But I had a kid years ago who needed this is tell you how many years ago it was, needed a Discman to sit in Sunday school, the old Sony Discman. And his dad said, "Did you tell him he could bring his Discman?" I told him he had to leave it in the car. And he says, "No, Neil said he could bring it to class." And I said, "Well, that's the only way I can get Rick to come to class and to not be a problem." And so I said, "Talk to your son." And his son loved coming to class. His son felt accepted. His son felt, and kind of like what Dina said, sometimes we think that the distraction is distracting them from listening. But oftentimes the fidget, the thing that is not fully distracting them from the message or the experience. And the number one experience they're getting is, hey, this is a place where I can come back to, that doesn't reject me, that accepts me as I am and can work with me. And we have time with the parents. But you can't work with a parent and a kid who's walked away because you've said, hey, you need to have an IEP, or you need to have a diagnosis before. I think that's a very special kind of ministry, and I applaud that. But I think for a lot of us, it's just the kids with quirks, the kids with the kids who need to bring the Walkman. And I don't know how I feel about tablets, because I know a lot of kids are hooked to those. I think we have a lot of work to do in that area, but experimenting with what works to unwrap that kid. How do you reach that kid, with the primary first objective being making sure that you're reaching the kid and helping them come back so you can continue to minister to them.
I'd like to add on to that. I really respect the fact that we need to understand diagnoses and look at IEPs and be responsible with the resources that we have available to us. And the church is a countercultural place. It's a place where everybody works, everybody is involved. And so if a family is beleaguered by reading through IEPs and checking checkboxes and trying to do everything right for their kids, and they can come into this oasis of calm or of acceptance that is really starkly different from what they do 5 or 6 other days of the week, then we're really being a gospel community. And it's very hard to walk that line between making sure we cover our liabilities and know that we're doing the right thing, and also to just be really left brain and soft and accepting about stuff.
If it's okay, I just wanted to speak a little bit to sort of the topic of allowing different things for different kids. I have two daughters. One has ADHD and the other doesn't. They're both really good readers. But for one daughter, we created a checklist of things she needed to bring to school every morning because she needed that support to help her get to school with everything and not have me driving gym shoes to school 3 days a week. And the other daughter didn't need that support. And so in our classroom, we often explain using something I learned at some point in college. I wish I could give proper credit, but that some people need a step stool, some people need a ladder. And so when I allow one student maybe to sit closer to me, or I ask one student to stand and pace while I'm talking because they learn better when their body's moving, or I allow a student to touch something in the classroom and be playing with something, and I ask somebody else, that isn't working right now, can you try something? That's a really good way for me to explain that it's always fair. We're going to be fair, but fair is we give everybody access to a chance to learn about Jesus while we're here. And so for us, that takes away the need to ask about a diagnosis or to ask for paperwork. And I understand a lot of churches have policies that they do like to have that paperwork in hand. I don't even ask for it, to be totally honest. We look at if the parent says it really helps them to do this, or if I notice it really helps them to do something, we find that helping them have the support that they need to be successful, regardless of what the paperwork says about that, is useful. And that also, however, applies to the entire class. So I'm called to minister to each individual kid, and I'm called to minister to each class. And so if having one student is distracting the rest of the class from being able to learn, I need to find some strategies and tools that are going to help that student to be successful in a way that doesn't negatively impact the rest of the class also. And so that might be the explanation to a parent of right now, I really wish that I could let your child stay in the classroom that they really loved last year, but for their sake and for the sake of the other kids in the classroom, I'm going to create this learning strategy for them. That might be not quite what the parents would have picked, but is equally giving them access to Bible learning. The other thing is sometimes we get caught up in the idea of like hands-on learning is the fun part, or flexible seating is the fun part, and then we go do the learning part. And I think it's important to realize those are all in one. Goes together. So the sensory bins are not a distraction from the learning. They are part of the learning. They are how a kid's brain connects with the thing you just taught them. You might be reading a Bible story, and their brain, it's why I'm addicted to rotation model. It lets their brain do the thing that kid brains do best, and make connections with the Bible in ways that they're able to do. And a lot of times that's through play and interaction. And then to answer the question about arguments over flexible seating, our rules for flexible seating, one of the first rules is that we're going to be thoughtful of others and where we sit. And so if there's maybe a disagreement between two kids on who's going to use it, we might ask them to write on the whiteboard, so-and-so used it this week, so next time it's my turn. Or they might set we have 3 or 4 timers, and they might set a timer and say partway through, we're going to swap. But also if they're goofing around with the friend next to them, rule number 2 is I choose my flexible seating, but if it's not working for me, I'll choose something that does. And so the kids have the opportunity, if that's not working, they can swap.
Do you consider criminal behavior, kids' criminal behavior? I'm saying that only somewhat facetiously. Kids who come to church and all they try to do is go steal extra cookies and find a room that nobody's in. Do you consider that part of neurodivergence or special needs, or is that a subset of this discussion? Because when Heather was talking about having somebody walk around, it triggered a memory of me. We had to have somebody. We had an awful building for Sunday school. It had so many rooms and places that weren't being used that we found kids wandering off in, of various ages. We didn't even know they were in the building because we didn't have a controlled access. And we eventually solved it by having, a volunteer guard basically go around and check all the spaces.
So very often, the acting out is the result of some need not being met. Now, I can't say that that's always the case, but a lot of what we call behavior problems are a result of some kind of unmet need or something that they're not getting. So yes, that is a part of this. I mean, I think in the past, a lot of kids were not diagnosed. They were just labeled as troublemakers, especially the ADHD kind of thing. And that whole boys would be boys kind of thing. But yes, I do think behavior is a subset of this, and some of that is finding out kind of what that student needs, even if it's one-on-one attention.
So rebellion, which is kind of a typical phase kids go through or get stuck in, I think,
Yeah.
is maybe we need to understand it in more medical or mental, emotional, and actual under neurodivergence.
Yeah. Well, we're all, like I said, we're all neurodiverse.
Yeah.
You know, we all have different ways that our brains are functioning, different ways that we function in general. And by trying to kind of meet them where they are, then that can help them. That can help bring them to Christ.
Or class.
Class or Christ, either one, whichever comes first.
It might be helpful also to know that one of the primary symptoms that arises for kids with ADHD is impulsive behavior. And so quite often, maybe that cookie opportunity where they're going to grab 5 other kids probably had the same thought and they did not act on that impulse. And for kids with ADHD, particularly kids who have not had much education or much help coping with that symptom, they're a lot more likely to grab that cookie because they struggle with impulse control and executive function, and the part of the brain that does that is not fully developed. And so that's going to be tougher for them. So a lot of times I reduce those opportunities for those things to be an issue, purely because I know that we have a lot of kids with a lot of things going on in their brains. And so we just maybe have a grown-up hand them out one at a time with a glove.
Well, I really appreciate your sharing your time and expertise and ideas, Dina, and everyone else. I think it's a good collaborative community, and we will have opportunities at the link that we have shared several times. If you want to go and post comments and share your resources, I'm going to take all this gold mine of resources and information that have been shared in the chat, and I will be going through those and sharing that all as well, so that we have links to a permanent place for all that information that's been shared. So thank you. You all have a great rest of your day and stay safe, especially those of you in the Southeast.